Welcome back to Talk Tensors. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a paper that's been making some waves, improving your model ranking on Chatbot Arena by vote rigging.
Yeah, definitely an interesting one.
It's all about this platform called Chatbot Arena, where basically they have all these large language models kind of duke it out in these like pairwise battles, right?
Yeah, it's really become pretty popular as like a benchmark for evaluating large language models.
And it's based on users like us, going in and voting on which model gives a better response. And then those votes, they actually end up determining the model's like ELO rating and its ranking on a leaderboard.
And like you said, it's become pretty much the go-to platform for a lot of people in the AI community to see, how these different models stack up against each other.
But here's where it gets a little unnerving. Okay.
Okay.
This paper reveals how these votes that are supposed to be like the foundation of, fair competition, how they can actually be manipulated.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a pretty concerning finding, right? Especially when you consider how much weight the Chatbot Arena leaderboard carries. Like a high ranking on there can lead to all sorts of benefits for developers. Increased visibility, bigger user base, maybe even attract some investors.
So it's not just about bragging rights then. There are some serious real-world implications here.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It raises questions about like the entire process of how we evaluate these large language models, if the rankings themselves can be gamed.
So you're telling me that these rankings, these seemingly objective numbers on this leaderboard, could be totally artificially inflated?
That's the scary part. The research lays out these two main rigging strategies, target-only and omnipresent rigging.
Okay, target-only, omnipresent rigging. Let's unpack that a little bit, starting with, I guess, the more straightforward one, target-only rigging. What does that even look like?
So with target-only rigging, the focus is solely on battles where your specific model is participating.
Okay, that makes sense. But hold on. How do you even know which model is yours if the battles are supposed to be anonymous?
Good question. That's one of the key points the researchers highlight. They talk about techniques like watermarking and classifiers that can be used to identify specific models even when they're presented anonymously.
So even though they try to make it anonymous, you can still figure out who's who.
Right. You can embed subtle markers in the model's output, kind of like a secret code.
Right.
That's watermarking. And then you have classifiers, which are trained to recognize the unique style of a specific model's output.
So you can basically fingerprint these models.
Exactly. But even if you can figure out which model is yours, if you're only targeting battles that involve your model, doesn't that seem like a really inefficient way to manipulate the rankings?
I mean, wouldn't that take forever?
Yeah.
Like if there are hundreds of models on Chatbot Arena, what are the chances that yours is going to be picked for any given battle?
You're hitting the nail on the head. That's the biggest drawback of target-only rigging. You could end up casting thousands and thousands of votes just to move your model up a few spots on the leaderboard.
That sounds exhausting. Like trying to win the lottery by buying every possible ticket combination possible, but not very practical.
Perfect analogy. And this is where things get really interesting. This brings us to omnipresent rigging. And the big idea here is that you actually don't need to directly target battles that involve your model. Instead, you can manipulate the system by rigging votes on any battle, regardless of whether your model is even involved.
Wait a minute. How does that even work? How can rigging a battle between two completely unrelated models benefit your own model?
It's all about understanding the interconnectedness of the ELO rating system. It's not just looking at individual battles. It calculates ratings based on all the votes cast on the entire platform. So even if you're indirectly rigging battles, it can create this ripple effect that subtly shifts the balance and ultimately boosts your target model's ranking.
So it's like strategically nudging the whole system in your favor, even though you're not directly involved in every battle.
Exactly. And the researchers call this the omni property of the ELO system. They detailed two main omnipresent rigging approaches, OmniBT and Omnion.
All right, OmniBT, Omnion. Let's break these down a little bit. What's the difference between the two?
So OmniBT stands for Bradley-Terry, which is the mathematical model that underpins the ELO system. And it requires having access to historical voting data. By analyzing past votes, OmniBT can determine which voting option in a new battle, even one that doesn't involve your model, will have the most impact on your target model's ranking.
So it's like having a master plan based on all the information you have available.
Exactly. Now, Omnion is a bit more subtle. It doesn't need access to all the historical voting data. It just needs the current Bradley-Terry scores, which are publicly available on the leaderboard. And it uses these scores to basically estimate the impact of different voting options, even if your target model isn't directly involved.
So it's like making strategic decisions with limited information, but still being able to influence the outcome. outcome.
Precisely.
But, okay, if these omnipresent rigging strategies are so clever, did the researchers actually test them out? Like, do they actually work in practice?
They did. They knew that real-world conditions aren't always perfect, so they ran simulations on a massive data set of actual Chatbot Arena votes. And they introduced challenges like, inaccurate model identification, unknown model sampling distributions, and of course the constant factor of legitimate votes from other users.
So they tried to make the simulations as realistic as possible, because even a rigged system has to deal with some level of randomness, right?
Right. And even with all those challenges, the omnipresent rigging strategies proved to be surprisingly resilient.
So even with imperfect information and all these other votes coming in,
Yeah.
someone could still manipulate the rankings.
That's what the research suggests.
Okay, that's a little unnerving. But simulations are one thing. Did they actually try rigging a real leaderboard?
They did. To validate their findings, they conducted a simulated vote rigging experiment on a smaller, more manageable leaderboard. And guess what? Both OmniBT and Omnion significantly outperformed target-only rigging, which shows just how effective they can be.
Okay, this is starting to get a little scary. It seems like Chatbot Arena, and maybe even other systems that rely on user feedback, might have a serious security flaw on their hands. What can be done to protect against this kind of manipulation?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The researchers do explore some potential defense mechanisms, but it's kind of a constant back and forth,
A cat and mouse game?
Exactly. As soon as you develop a defense, someone will figure out a way around it.
So we're in an arms race.
Pretty much. One idea is to try to detect users who are submitting duplicate votes, like always abstaining or always voting for a tie.
I can see how that would be suspicious.
Yeah, those patterns are pretty easy to spot, but a smart manipulator could easily adapt and avoid detection.
I guess they could just mix in some legitimate votes to make it look less obvious.
Exactly. Another approach is to try to identify users who have statistically improbable voting patterns.
So like if someone consistently votes against the way the models usually perform.
Right. If someone's always going against the historical win rates, that's a red flag.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But couldn't a sophisticated manipulator just figure out those patterns and then throw in a few wrong votes here and there to make it look more natural?
Absolutely. So the researchers suggest that instead of just focusing on user behavior, maybe the best defense is to make it harder for those automated rigging scripts to operate in the first place.
Okay, so putting up roadblocks to make it more difficult for bots to just cast tons of votes.
Right. Make it more challenging for them.
What kind of roadblocks are we talking about here?
Well, one intriguing idea is to use CAPT-CHA style challenges as part of the voting process.
You mean like those puzzles where you have to identify images or solve a little math problem to prove you're not a robot?
Exactly. So before someone's vote is counted, they'd have to solve one of these puzzles, which would make it a lot harder for those automated scripts to just churn through votes.
That's pretty clever. It adds a layer of friction for bots. But wouldn't that also be annoying for legitimate users? I mean, nobody likes extra steps.
That's a valid point. It's all about finding the right balance.
Yeah.
Too much friction, and you might discourage people from voting legitimately, but too little, and the system is still wide open to manipulation.
And what about those really advanced bots that we hear so much about, the ones that can beat humans at all these complicated games?
Yeah.
Couldn't they eventually figure out how to get around those CAPT-CHA codes too?
It's possible,
Right.
but it would at least make it more difficult for them. They'd have to invest more time and effort to figure it out, and who knows, maybe this whole research paper will inspire people to develop even more robust CAPT-CHA challenges that are specifically designed to be AI-proof.
It's like a constant race to stay one step ahead, right? Making sure our defenses can keep up with the latest tactics that these manipulators are using.
Exactly.
It's a fascinating topic for sure. But let's shift gears for a second. This deep dive has been really insightful. I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier. You talked about some novel notions. What are some of the potential avenues for exploration that this research has opened up?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this research goes beyond just Chatbot Arena. It highlights a much broader issue, which is the vulnerability of any system that relies on user feedback ratings or votes. So the question is, could these same manipulation tactics be used to influence outcomes on other online platforms as well?
Like what kinds of platforms are we talking about?
Think about things like product reviews or social media rankings or even online elections.
Wow, you're making me rethink everything I thought I knew about online platforms.
It's a bit unsettling when you realize how easily these systems that we rely on every day could be manipulated. And it underscores the importance of critical thinking in our digital world. We have to be aware of this potential for manipulation and develop strategies for figuring out what's genuine and what's been artificially inflated or deflated.
It's a challenge for sure.
Hmm.
But, every challenge also presents an opportunity.
That's a great way to look at it, and this research is no exception.
So what kind of opportunities are we talking about here?
Well, the researchers actually propose a few really interesting ideas. And one that I found particularly thought-provoking was this idea of intentionally introducing a controlled form of rigging to actually improve the evaluation process. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but hear me out.
Intentional rigging
Mm-hmm.
to make the evaluations better. I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, imagine you have this groundbreaking new AI model, something that's totally different from anything else out there. Let's just call it hypothetical GPT for now.
Okay. Hypothetical GPT.
So hypothetical GPT has the potential to be amazing. It could revolutionize the field, but its output is so unconventional that it might actually be penalized in head-to-head battles against models that are more familiar to people.
Because people are used to a certain way of doing things.
Right. And remember, the ELO system is heavily influenced by past performance. So if hypothetical GPT starts off losing a bunch of battles just because people aren't used to its unique style, it could get stuck at a low ranking, even if it's actually a better model.
So it's like a brilliant musician who comes out with a completely new genre of music. People might not get it at first.
Exactly. And this is where the controlled rigging comes in. What if we could temporarily boost hypothetical GPT's ranking? Just enough to give it a fair chance to be evaluated on its own merits rather than being immediately dismissed because it's different. We could introduce a set of synthetic votes that are designed to counterbalance any initial bias against its unconventional style.
So you're basically leveling the playing field, giving this new model a chance to prove itself.
Exactly. It's like using training wheels on a bike. You need them at first to get going, but eventually you don't need them anymore.
I like that analogy. But wouldn't it be incredibly difficult to implement something like this? How do you decide how much to boost a model's ranking? And how do you make sure those synthetic votes are gradually phased out as the model becomes more accepted?
You're right. It wouldn't be easy. You'd need a very carefully designed system for generating those synthetic votes and a reliable mechanism for removing them over time. And of course, there's always the risk that someone could abuse the system. What's stopping someone from boosting their own mediocre model just to game the system?
That's a good point. If we're going to allow any kind of manipulation, even with good intentions, we need to be extremely careful to prevent abuse.
Absolutely. Transparency and oversight would be essential. Maybe an independent group could be responsible for overseeing the whole process, making sure it's only being used to support genuinely innovative models and not for personal gain. But even with those challenges, I think it's an idea worth exploring.
I agree. It's definitely a thought-provoking approach that challenges us to think outside the box and consider new solutions.
It really makes you think about how we evaluate these AI systems, especially in a field that's changing so rapidly. Like what worked in the past might not be good enough for evaluating these new models that are coming out, especially the ones that are pushing the boundaries and doing things in completely new ways.
It's like how photography changed the art world. All of a sudden, artists didn't have to just paint realistically anymore. They could experiment with all sorts of new styles. Maybe we're at a similar point with AI where we need to rethink how we evaluate these models so we can capture the full range of possibilities.
Yeah.
Even the ones that seem weird or unconventional at first.
Exactly. But before we wrap up, I have one more novel notion that I want to throw out there. It builds on this idea of intentionally challenging the evaluation process. It's a little out there, but I think it's worth considering.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
What if we developed an adversarial evaluation system for AI models?
Adversarial evaluation. That sounds intense.
So imagine a system where, in addition to human evaluators, we also have these rigging agents, which are basically AI systems that are specifically designed to manipulate the rankings.
So we're going to let these AI troublemakers loose and just let them mess with the system.
Well, not exactly. These rigging agents wouldn't just be acting randomly. They would be trained to exploit the same vulnerabilities that human manipulators might use, but with a specific goal in mind, to expose the weaknesses of the models being evaluated. It's like penetration testing, but for AI.
So you're intentionally trying to break the models to see where they're vulnerable.
That's the idea. By observing how these rigging agents are able to manipulate the rankings, we can learn a lot about the model's weaknesses. For example, if a rigging agent consistently boosts a model's ranking by explaining a specific type of bias, that tells us there's a problem with the model's design that needs to be addressed.
That's a really interesting concept.
Yeah.
By creating this adversarial environment, you're basically forcing the models to step up their game and show what they're really made of.
Exactly. The goal of evaluation isn't just to rank models. It's to push the field forward and encourage innovation. And sometimes the best way to do that is to introduce a bit of healthy competition, even if it comes from an unexpected source.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. We started by talking about the vulnerabilities of Chatbot Arena's voting system, and we ended up discussing the future of AI evaluation as a whole.
It's amazing how a simple concept like user voting can lead to such complex questions about fairness, transparency, and what it even means to make progress in AI.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that as AI becomes more and more integrated into our lives, we need to be constantly questioning our assumptions and coming up with new ways to evaluate and govern these powerful technologies.
Couldn't agree more.
But before we wrap up, I think it's important to emphasize that these novel notions are just the ideas to spark discussion and encourage further exploration. We're not suggesting that anyone should go out and implement these ideas tomorrow.
Yeah, these are more like thought experiments meant to push the boundaries and inspire creative thinking in the AI community.
Exactly. But who knows? Maybe one of these seemingly crazy ideas will eventually lead to a major breakthrough in how we evaluate AI. So on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Be sure to check the episode description for a link to the full research paper. And we encourage you to dive into the details and form your own opinions on this fascinating topic.
And as always, keep those novel notions coming. The future of AI depends on our collective imagination and our willingness to challenge the status quo.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.